Our New Testament passage from the Gospel of Mark begins at Mark chapter 5, verse 21. In this passage, Jesus is further revealing the nature of his authority to the people. And here he shows that it extends to healing, mercy-making, and peace-giving as he encounters a woman and a child in need. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now, there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and she had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the leader any further? Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As happens occasionally in studying this passage, I was moved to write a first-person monologue sermon from the point of view of the woman with the hemorrhage. "Mother, I heard at the well that Rachel is dying. I looked up from the hearth where I was stirring a pot. No. Rachel, smart, funny, curious, 12-year-old Rachel. How could it be? She was the daughter of my friend Rivka, my lifelong friend who I've known from the time we were both babes in our mother's arms. You talk of lives going in different directions. Rivka was the wife of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, which means Rivka was a leader among the women of our community. She was a woman of honor, of valor, a scholar like her husband. As for me, I had spent the past 12 years at home, or at the doctor, or the healer, or the herb seller. My daughter was nodding, breathless with the exertion of hurrying in with 2 large buckets of water. Yes, Amma, Rachel has been wasting away. That is what they say. And these last 3 days she has been in bed, unable to speak. She paused, then whispered, her eyes bright with tears. They think she will not live. I felt a sickness in my stomach that rivaled my illness. Rachel, I looked at my wonderful daughter, 16 years old, so strong and kind, so sensitive, understanding how this news would pierce my heart. The thought of Rivka losing her child, this was all I needed to hear. I had been home, trapped inside the fear and anxiety of my woman's illness, this hemorrhage, my 12-year ordeal. I had relied on my good family to take care of all aspects of living. I had relied on my oldest to take on the responsibilities of the mother of the family because my illness had so consumed and frightened me. I had little energy to devote to anyone or anything else. And now my dearest friend was facing this terrible moment, and I'd had no idea. This was all I needed to hear. I stood up and wrapped my shawl around me and stepped out into the bright day. It was strange to be heading out on an errand that had nothing to do with my illness. It was unfamiliar, this feeling of being drawn to the side of someone else, to think of their needs for a change. As I walked, I felt the weight of the many years of my friendship with Rivka, a friendship that had given me so much joy. But these past years, everything that did not promise me a cure had been cast aside. Rivka's invitations to sit by her hearth, or to come be with the other women at the synagogue, or to celebrate her son's marriage. Nothing had been able to lure me outside the boundaries of my own fear and worry. Until now. I had a strange feeling of hope as I walked through the village center. It was late in the morning now, and people were out and about, heading to the market, visiting with one another. The crowds grew thicker, strangely thick, astonishing numbers of people, and I searched my memory, wondering whether my husband or daughter had told me of anything unusual going on. Everyone seemed to be streaming towards the village center, and I found myself swept along. Then I realized what was happening. I could see a little clearing, a space in the crowd where 2 men talked. And one of them was Jairus. I could tell by his clothing, but more than that, by his expression, his gestures. The leader of our synagogue, this man of great dignity and intelligence, was pleading. He was begging. I gasped. Jairus had fallen to his knees. I felt my heart heave in my chest. I heard just a few words, carried on the light morning breeze. Please come, that she may live. But it wasn't Jairus who drew me forward, whose presence beckoned me to come near, to get closer. It was the other man, the one who was listening deeply to Jairus' plea, the one who took Jairus by the arm and lifted him up and set off with him towards his home. I followed. I followed partially because that's where I was going anyway, the home of Rivka and Jairus. And I followed as a part of this great crowd of people who seemed determined to go where these men were going. And I followed too because I had finally understood who this man was. This was Yeshua ben Joseph. It was that healer, Jesus. I had first heard of Jesus from my husband and my daughter. First, I'd heard he had cast out demons of this one and restored someone else's ability to walk and healed a woman who had a fever. And then the stories seemed to take on a fantastical dimension. He'd healed dozens. He'd healed hundreds. The more stories I'd heard, the more skeptical I'd become. You don't spend 12 years seeking out healing for yourself without developing a kind of fence around your heart where the hope lives. The more outrageous the claims about Jesus, the less inclined I'd been to go. Until now. I had seen what? I had seen Jairus' desperation, yes, but I had also seen something in Jesus that I had not seen in any of the healers I had sought out. I'd seen a look in his eyes of the greatest compassion. I'd seen sorrow, as if the pain of Jairus entered him physically, as if he were ready to weep right along with this frightened man. And suddenly I thought, if I could just touch him, maybe not touch him, maybe just his robe or even the fringe of that robe, maybe some of that compassion will be there for me. And I found myself hurrying, almost running, closing the distance between us, reaching my hand out, and I thought a lot about what happened next. This is the only way I can describe it. As I touched the healer's robe, I felt a great silence surround me, as if the crowd had receded and there was no one there except Jesus and me. I stopped. I stood very still. I even closed my eyes. And I realized I knew. The hemorrhage had stopped. I was healed. I was whole. I could feel it in my body, a great sense of peace. We call this sense of wholeness, we call this sense of peace, shalom. When I opened my eyes, there was Jesus looking right at me, because of course he had stopped too. How could he not? And he had turned around and I could see his followers, several men, leaning towards him, whispering in his ear, urging him to continue on. Jairus was looking at me, agitated, confused. At first I couldn't think why, and then I realized, Lord have mercy, I'd stopped the healer on his way to Jairus' house. I dropped to my knees, and now words spilled out of me as I tried to explain what had happened. Jesus looked at me, those eyes so full of compassion. The tiniest flicker of a smile passed over his face, and he placed a hand on my shoulder. Daughter, you are well. Be at peace. Shalom. I hardly had time to take in his words before another man rushed out of the crowd to say the horrible words that Jairus had dreaded. Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? No. The full horror seeped in. Rachel. I watched as Jesus led his followers and Jairus away, still towards the leader's home. I hung back. He'd issued a stern warning not to follow. The crowd hesitated, confused at this turn of events. I followed them anyway. Nothing, not even Jesus' words, could keep me from my friend now. We wound through the streets and came upon the house, surrounded by the professional mourners. Their wails echoed on the otherwise silent stones and patios of the buildings. Jairus' head was low as he entered the home. His face was a mask of grief. As Jesus and his entourage entered the house, I heard his quiet voice again. Don't be afraid. Believe. A moment later, the door opened again, and there was an exodus of servants, scribes, mourners, and hangers-on. The streets began to fill with people, the mourners making half-hearted attempts at a wail now and then, but mostly people murmuring. He was a healer, yes, but the child was dead. I stood against a wall, breathing hard, praying, if you must know, praying to God above that the state of this child was not beyond Jesus' power to heal. That she may live, I prayed, that she may live. The prayer of her father and mother and everyone who loved them. I could feel the cold of the stone through my clothes, and I felt strange and alive. More alive at this moment than I had in a long time. A hand touched my shoulder again, and I turned to see my daughter. We smiled, and we exchanged a look that conveyed more than words could say. And then we heard the shouting. The doors to Jairus and Rivka's home burst open, and the three men who'd followed Jesus came out laughing. One of them shouted, She lives! A shout arose from the crowd, almost as one, and then the sound of people laughing and crying like my daughter and me. We held each other, shaking for the unbelievable good news. Someone somewhere started playing a flute, and then there was a tambourine, and within moments a song had gone up, a psalm of David, a song of thanksgiving for the goodness of God. Bless the Lord, O my soul, all that is within me. Bless God's holy name. A few professional mourners stood awkwardly, wondering what their role was in all this, but even they, after a few minutes, joined in the relief, the wonder, the joy. Later, after the celebration had quieted down and the family sent everyone away, my daughter and I walked home together. Neither of us felt compelled to speak. We were still filled with the astonishment of this day. Again and again, I remembered the look in his eyes, the deep compassion of Jesus that reached out and held me, healed me. I realized then that my prayer for Rachel had also been my prayer for myself, though I hadn't known it, that she may live, that I may live. I had been released, not just from the disease, but from fear. For 12 years, my fear had robbed my family and friends of my presence. For 12 years, I had known myself only as sick and diseased. Jesus had freed me from my fear that I might live. And now I knew how I wanted to live. A life in which that compassion that had been shown to me could be released to others, traveling from Jesus to me and then out again, to the man whose child did not live, to the lepers living out by the graveyard, to the woman consumed with her anger. Jesus had healed my body, but he had also healed my heart, my soul, my life. He had healed me so that I may live. I pray that for all of us, that we may be healed, that we may be whole, that we may live. Thanks be to God. Amen.